Yeah.
Okay.
Everyone knows I just started the recording and we're going to be live streaming in about 5 to 10 seconds.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, let's start. Okay. Thank you for participating in our Penn Population Studies Colloquium series. We're excited to be able to continue this long-standing tradition of engaging in population science with experts from across the world. Before I introduce the speaker today, I'd like to remind you that this colloquium and questions and answers will be recorded for the purpose of dissemination on the PSC YouTube channel. As you may have noticed, your video and audio are turned off. This is intentional. We ask you to please submit your questions through the question and answer tool. You can either type your question or just let me know that you have a question. At the end of the talk, I will call on people to ask their question using their own voice. If you do not wish to be called on, please submit your questions anonymously. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce to you today James Raymo. Jim is professor of sociology and the Henry Wentworth Professor of East Asian Studies at Princeton University. He recently moved to the area, and we welcome him to the broader Penn area. Jim is among the leading social demographers whose research focuses on understanding the consequences and potential for change of demographic changes related to population aging in East Asia, especially Japan. He has published extensively on issues such as marriage timing, divorce, recession and fertility, marriage and women's health, single mothers' well-being, living alone, family change and social inequality, employment and health at older ages, and regional differences in health and older ages. As you can see, he has a very broad research agenda. He is currently engaged in 3 main projects. The first is an examination of the socioeconomic and family correlates of children's academic performance, personal relationships, and emotional health in China and Korea. The second project is a study of the social, cultural, economic, and policy factors underlying striking demographic similarities among countries in East Asia and Southern Europe, including gender inequality, family ties, and uncertainty. The third project is a study of the well-being of single mothers and their children in Japan. His research has appeared in the most leading journals in the discipline, including the American Sociological Review, American Journal of Sociology, Demography, Journal of Gerontology, Social Sciences, and Journal of Marriage and the Family, as well as in Japanese journals. It's a great pleasure to welcome him to the PSC Colloquium, and thank you, Jim, for being willing to share your work with us today. Welcome.
Yeah. Thank you, Emilio, for the introduction. It's absolutely my pleasure to be here. Let me share my screen here as instructed. There, hopefully that looks good for everybody. Again, thanks for the introduction, like I said, and thanks, Emilio, Ileana, Hans-Peter, for the invitation. As Emilio said, I've recently arrived in the area and very much looking forward to the opportunity to spend time with my colleagues and friends in Philadelphia. And unfortunately, it's not going to happen today. But looking forward to the opportunity when it arises. So having said that, I'd like to jump right in and tell you that the title that was given to you is not exactly what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to talk about something very closely related. But the title for the talk that I would like to give is this: Educational Differences in the Economic Well-Being of Divorced Mothers in Japan. So this is very much along the lines of that third project that Emilio just introduced to you, and want to be focusing here on the roles of employment history, financial support, and remarriage in understanding those educational differences. So that's where we're going to go. Before I jump in to the talk itself, would like to make sure that I acknowledge my co-author, This is collaborative with Jia Wang, who is a 5th year now, I believe, graduate student at Wisconsin, somebody I've been working with very closely. And a lot of what I'm going to be showing is, her contributions are very much front and center. So I do want to make sure that everybody is aware that this is very much a collaborative effort. So, and the only other thing, I guess, the other housekeeping thing that I'd like to say is that this is absolutely preliminary work. I've had a chance to present something close to this once before, but this is, really in the early stages. So I will do my very best to not ramble on forever and leave a lot of time for your questions and comments, criticisms. If there is a case where we don't have enough time to get to everybody's questions, feel free to shoot me an email. I'd be more than happy to hear what you think about what we're doing and get suggestions for how we might do it better. So I want to spend the first 10, 15 minutes or so, perhaps, focusing on the theoretical background, theoretical motivation. There's really, I think, a broad theoretical motivation for what we're doing here. And then, of course, there's the empirical work. And I think at this point, if I look at what Jia and I have done and sort of evaluate it myself to the degree that I can do that objectively, I do think that there's kind of a mismatch between the two components right now, the motivation and what we're actually doing. So that would be something that I would love to hear your thoughts on as you have a chance to evaluate what we've done so far. But let me, before I jump into the background, just tell you the research questions up front so you know where we're going, what we're doing, and you'll be prepared when the summary of the data and the results are presented. So the first question is really about the original title. It's about all mothers, and we want to evaluate the degree to which the educational gradient in mothers' economic disadvantage, measured in a variety of ways, is accounted for by differences in employment trajectories and in divorce. So as I'm going to develop in the next several minutes, this is really motivated by the idea of diverging destinies and trying to think about the intersection of family behavior and differentials in family behavior and the way that those are reflected in differences in economic well-being and other measures of resources that may be available to children and to help us understand the reproduction of disadvantage and socioeconomic gradients in children's well-being. So that's the first one. And I'll try to be brief on this particular part. And the second set of questions is really focused on this narrower a set of analyses that is limited to ever divorced mothers. And we want to first quantify the magnitude of the educational gradient in economic disadvantage among ever divorced mothers. We're certain that it's large based on a lot of other research that we've done on single mothers, the project that Emilio mentioned. But we like to quantify it as a first step in setting up the next sets of questions, which are very similar to the broader question. In the third question, we want to evaluate how much of that educational gradient in ever divorced mothers' economic disadvantage is accounted for by differences in employment trajectories. And I'm going to try to develop why I think the employment trajectory focus is important, particularly in the Japanese context. But let me just give you a hint right now so you don't sit wondering why we're thinking about these questions. I'm going to show you that unstable employment, particularly around first birth, is very common in Japan. And as those of you who are familiar with Sarah McClanahan's work and this whole idea of diverging destinies are well aware, unstable employment and the concentration of unstable employment or discontinuous employment among those with lower levels of education is thought to be sort of one of the core family behaviors of interest in this framework that tries to link family behavior to economic inequality in children's resources. So having done that, we want to think not just about employment trajectories, but about other characteristics that may help us to understand the educational gradient in ever divorced mothers' economic disadvantage. And I'll talk more about that later. And I mentioned that we want to measure economic well-being in a variety of ways for some different reasons. So we want to evaluate the degree to which our answers to these other questions may depend on how we actually go about measuring economic disadvantage. And I've done work that's related to this in a lot of other papers, but we typically focus on one at a time. And there hasn't really been a systematic effort to evaluate and understand how answers to questions like these about economic disadvantage, how those answers may depend on how we actually go about measuring economic disadvantage. So the this project, the broader project, of which I'm going to present one of what I anticipate being 2 or 3 papers, closely related papers. It really sits at the intersection of the research, that third research project on the well-being of single mothers and the role of family support. A lot of the work that we've done on single motherhood really tries to understand the degree to which, in the Japanese context, the high prevalence of co-residence with parents may mitigate some of the disadvantage that single mothers face, economic disadvantage in particular, that single mothers face in Japan. But this hasn't really been linked yet to this notion of diverging destinies and thinking about family bifurcation and inequality. So this is really an effort to try to merge these two bodies of research. An empirical area that I've had an interest in for a long time, and a more theoretical area that has informed a lot of the work I've done, not just on single mothers, but on other work as well. And I should state the obvious. I'm interested in these things because I think they're of potential relevance, real relevance in the Japanese context for understanding growing inequality, and particularly for understanding the extreme economic disadvantage that single mothers and their children face in Japan. I'll show you some data on that shortly. Just a sec. So I don't know everybody's interests in the audience. In fact, I don't even know who's in the audience or how many of you are in the audience. But hopefully most of you are familiar with this idea of diverging destinies. A real, I think, powerful, compelling, and to date, very influential framework for thinking about the ways in which demographic behavior, so particularly as Sarah McClanahan's PAA presidential address suggests, family behaviors associated with the second demographic transition, so divorce, non-marital childbearing, stable versus unstable employment, things like this, how these are related to differences in the resources that children have access to, and how those differences help us to understand inequality in resources that children have and the implications for the reproduction of inequality. Reproduction of disadvantage. So as you can see, this is a very well-cited framework. It's been addressed by a variety of scholars in a variety of contexts. And I was just having a conversation prior to this talk with your colleague Hanjun Park about the fact that despite the seemingly good empirical reasons for a similar set of ideas to be informing research on demographic change and inequality in East Asia, Japan and Korea in particular, there really doesn't seem to be that much. So I really want to try to think about how we can integrate the Japanese and Korean experience and data into this broader discussion about diverging destinies and broader literature. So I've said that I think that this is an important and compelling and influential framework, but I do think that there are some real limitations with the diverging destinies literature as it's been articulated so far. I've already mentioned the fact that, or I hinted at the fact that it's largely limited to Western countries. One thing that we're really trying to address in this paper by focusing on both divorce and employment trajectories is the fact that although theoretically diverging destinies is really something about a constellation or a package of family behaviors, including those that I just mentioned, the tendency in the empirical work is to focus on one behavior or outcome at a time. So let's see how non-marital childbearing is related to children's resources or maternal well-being. Let's see how divorce is related to maternal well-being. And this is a very initial effort to try to think about this constellation as a whole and think about the ways in which these various family behaviors together may contribute to our understanding of linkages between family and inequality in ways that we haven't been able to do by focusing on one at a time. So that's one. The third is that there's a lot of attention to compositional differences in trends. That is, women at the low end of the educational distribution and those at the high end of the educational distribution are increasingly doing family in different ways that has implications for the resources available to their children. That's the compositional focus. However, there's little or no attention to differences in relationships, or what in the decomposition terminology we often refer to as returns. That is, yes, we know that low educated women are much more likely to divorce, and that may be relevant for understanding differences in children's well-being. But we don't know, or we do know from other research, I think, but within the diverging destinies literature, I think there's less explicit attention to the possibility that divorce may be, the penalty associated with divorce may be greater or lesser for women at different points in the educational distribution in ways that help us understand that process of transmission. And that's another thing that we want to try to address. And there's been limited attention to other educational differences in family behaviors, family outcomes that may mitigate or exacerbate the implications of bifurcation in these more widely studied outcomes. And I'm going to talk a little bit in just a sec about some of the things that we're thinking about here. So to address these limitations, we're going to focus on inequality in Japan, East Asia more generally in later work, try to consider interrelationships among a constellation of family behavior, starting with two in this study. The other paper in this project, not what I'm going to present today, is going to be a sort of decomposition analysis that tries to cast a really wide net and evaluate the roles of both compositional and relationship differences in understanding how differences in family behavior are associated with differences in well-being. And then the fourth is to expand the focus a little bit to think about other potentially relevant factors, things that we think may be related to both educational attainment, mother's educational attainment or socioeconomic status more generally, and family behavior, and the economic outcomes or other outcomes of interest. And here in this study, we're going to focus on support from ex-husbands, extended family support. I mentioned earlier the focus on co-residence, and that's what we're going to be looking at here, and repartnering or remarriage in the Japanese context. So these are the three that we're going to be focusing on in this paper. This isn't the first time that we've thought about bringing the Japanese context or thinking about demographic trends in the Japanese case into the diverging destinies literature. Here's a brief sort of maybe a glorified working paper, I guess we could call it, that a colleague, Miho Iwasawa, and I published a couple of years ago, in which we tried to think about the ways in which this framework of diverging destinies may or may not be immediately applicable to the Japanese context, and try to provide a little bit of background. But at any rate, the point I guess I'm trying to make here is that this is something that has been on my mind for a while and is something that will motivate a lot of the work that I'm doing with colleagues going forward. And I should note that this overview focuses on a whole range of different family behaviors, whereas the talk today is going to focus primarily on divorce. There is almost no non-marital childbearing in Japan, so the rise in single mother families is almost entirely attributable to divorce. I'll provide some data on this in just a second. But there's a lot of media attention to the extreme economic disadvantage faced by single mothers in Japan and their children, and thinking about the implications of this for broader patterns of inequality. And there is some research on this, but I would argue that there's not a whole lot of research that's being done on this, certainly not that's appearing in the English language literature. And most importantly, for the purposes of this talk and this paper, none of this is explicitly integrating this emphasis on the economic disadvantage of single mothers and their children into this broader, internationally relevant theoretical framework for understanding linkages between family behavior and economic well-being or inequality. So that's really where we see our contribution lying. So let's jump into the data. A little bit of background data before we jump into the data specific to our analyses. Since I've already indicated that the rise in single mother families in Japan is due to divorce, let's take a look at trends in divorce. I should note that roughly 1 in 10 families with children is a single parent family in Japan right now. Obviously, that's lower than in some other countries, but is higher than I think most people believe it to be in the Japanese context, and I think higher than most people in Japan believe it to be in the Japanese context. So relevant and important. This here, so the little orange dots are just the indicating at 10-year intervals trends in the divorce rate, the number of divorces per, I can't actually see it on here. Is it 10,000? For 1,000 married couples. And then the blue lines here show the number of divorces. That's on the left vertical axis. You can see about 250,000 cases of divorce per year in recent years. And the thing that I really want to emphasize here are these 3 different shades of blue. The light blue at the bottom, those are divorces that don't involve children. The next little sliver there, the middle color blue, are cases where the fathers get sole custody. And the darker blue, the large proportion, are the cases where mothers get sole custody. So in cases where children are involved, mothers get sole custody in about 80% of all divorces. That's where single mother families come from. And as you'll understand as I move forward, that's where some of the disadvantage lies, because the little gray line, that's joint custody. So joint custody doesn't really exist in Japan. And when we start to talk about support from ex-husbands, it'll be clear that the involvement of the non-custodial parent in children's lives, both in terms of time contributions and in terms of financial contributions, is minimal in many cases. So just a little bit of background to get us started here. These are some figures from some previous work that we've done, including a couple from that little Springer book that I showed you, that try to document educational differences in divorce. So these are all looking at differences by women's education in the probability of having experienced divorce on the top left, having your marriage end in divorce within the first 10 years of marriage, the bottom left, or the estimated risk of having your marriage end in divorce from event history models in the table on the right. And basically what all of these show is if we ignore the blue, ignore the junior high school graduates, this is a very small group in Japan, an extremely unusual group that's an outlier in all ways. If we ignore them and focus on the red and black and other lines and the estimated hazard ratios over here on the right, we'll see that there is a very clear gradient. It may not be as large as it is in other countries, but it's very clear that women with lower levels of education, for example, high school graduates, are much more likely to experience divorce than are those with 2 or 4 year college degrees. So I'll show you more data on this in a minute. So I mentioned that I showed you the newspaper clippings indicating that poverty among single mothers is a big issue in Japan. And let me provide a little bit of comparative data to make that pretty clear. I think this and the next slide are from the OECD Family Database. So, data that we're all familiar with. And I realized that, wow, this actually looks pretty good on a big screen. I was looking at this on my my laptop and thinking nobody's ever going to be able to read this. But if you have a big screen, you can read it and see the country names on the left here. This is the percent of families in relative poverty, so falling below the relative poverty line, less than half of the median equivalized household income. And the countries are ordered by the poverty rate among two-parent families with children, the light gray lines, Denmark at the top, Israel at the bottom, Israel and Mexico at the bottom. And the darker lines are single mother poverty. So you see Japan here, which I've highlighted in orange and red. The two-parent family poverty rate is a little bit above average, so 12, 13% in Japan. But what's really striking, of course, as you've already figured out as I introduced this, is the poverty rate among single parents with children. And when we say single parents, we've already seen that it, in most cases, means single mothers. The poverty rate is about 55% in these data, surpassed only by that of Luxembourg. And I should note that Luxembourg tends to fluctuate a little bit. I don't know why. Japan really doesn't fluctuate. It's 50, 55% in all recent years. So economic disadvantage among single mother families and their children is extreme in Japan, certainly relative to other wealthy countries and certainly relative to other families within Japan. And this isn't due to the fact that single mothers don't work. This is a slide showing the labor force participation rate of single mothers, single parent families, actually, sorry, single mothers in this case. And you can see that Japan is among the highest. About 85% of single mothers are in the labor force employed. So it really is about the wages that are available and issues around work-family balance, which we won't talk about. But to some degree, this really does motivate the focus on employment as a potentially relevant factor, something that I'll show you more on in the next couple of slides here. So these are data not on single mothers. These are data on all mothers. These are women who have been married for 5 to 9 years and have at least one child that is 1 year old or older. So recently married mothers of small children. And this is from National Fertility Survey data covering a period of about, not quite 25 years. And I want to emphasize a couple of things here. And I'll note that these are, the lines are the percent of people who fall into different categories of a very simple classification of labor force or employment continuity. So respondents are asked, which of the following best describes your employment trajectory since marriage? The orange in the middle is continuous. I've been employed continuously. The yellow at the top is women who dropped out of work before their first child was born and have remained out of the labor force. The gray is those who dropped out before the birth of their first child, but re-entered the labor force and were employed at the time of the survey. So what you can see is that homemakers have gone down in recent years, something that a lot of people are very interested in trying to make sense of in the Japanese case, and continuous employment has increased, perhaps in response to changes in labor laws, changes in family care leave laws, and particularly probably the increasingly difficult economic circumstances that families find themselves in. But be that as it may, there's a little change. What I really want to highlight here, though, is the fact that if we aggregate the homemakers, those who leave and stay out, and the re-enterers, those who leave and go back in other words, women, mothers, with discontinuous employment trajectories around first birth, you can see that it's still 60%. It's been about 2/3, even going further back, if I were to show you data from earlier surveys, going back to the 80s. So for 30 some years, roughly 2/3 of women left the labor force around the timing of, around marriage or the birth of their first child. Many returned, many didn't. But this is critical, I think, because remember, if we think about the kinds of behaviors that are central to this idea of diverging destinies, as McClanahan and others have articulated it, really this notion of continuous employment or career employment and its contrast with tangential or marginal or inconsistent employment and the ways that those patterns differ across socioeconomic strata, typically proxied by educational attainment, as we do here. This is something that's central to the diverging destinies literature, and is something that hasn't been thought about in that context really at all in the Japanese case. And in fact, I'm not really aware of many studies, any studies, I don't think in English off the top of my head, that address this. That is the degree to which these different trajectories of employment may differ by mothers' educational attainment and the implications that those differences may have for well-being. So, moving along, that's really the motivation for what we're doing. And now I'm going to jump into the data and the analyses that address those 4 or 5 research questions that I laid out at the beginning. I'm going to be working exclusively from here on out, showing you results from here on out that are based on a survey called the National Survey of Households with Children. There have been 5 rounds of this. It's a repeated cross-section conducted by the Japan Institute for Labor Policy and Training. It's a kind of quasi-public think tank affiliated with the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare. And the beauty of this survey, I should give a little shout out here to my colleague, Yanfei Zhou, who is the PI of this particular survey, and somebody who's done an awful lot of work to really bring research on the economic circumstances of single mothers to the fore in Japan. The beauty of this survey is that we can study single mothers because there is a huge oversample of single mothers in this survey. If we used another survey like the National Fertility Surveys or the Japan General Social Surveys, we'd really be lost because there wouldn't be enough single mothers in there to really allow for comparisons or allow for focused analyses on single mothers. These are really structured so that the sampling, the target sample is 2,000 married two-parent mothers in two-parent families and 2,000 mothers in single-parent families in each year. There are big differences, not surprisingly, in response rates for the 2 groups. So there are a lot more married mothers than single mothers, but nevertheless, there are a lot of single mothers that allow us to focus exclusively on this group and to try to better understand what's going on with respect to their economic well-being in this case. We're using 4 rounds of data. We're not using the first round because the questions about employment trajectories were a little bit different in the first round, and it's not really possible to create comparable measures in that round for inclusion with the others. After we exclude that and exclude some missing data, we have about a little over 7,000 mothers total and a little over 2,000 single mothers. So those are the samples that I'm going to be working with in the results that are going to be the basis of the results that I show you in the next few slides. But first, just briefly to define the 4 measures of economic disadvantage that we're going to be working with. I've already shown you one in that OECD figure, being in the lowest quartile of within sample equivalized household income. And you can see that among the divorced, and these aren't comparable to the OECD data really because, you know, that's single mothers, these are ever divorced mothers, but 55%, that's really close. 19% is a little higher than the overall. But at any rate, that's one measure, that's the conventional measure. A real problem with this is, of course, this is a sample survey and household income data are missing for a lot of people. We use 2 subjective measures. One is a measure of economic need. And these are all 0-1 measures, I should say. We're estimating linear probability models throughout. So working with 0-1 measures. In the first one, are you in the lowest quartile or not? The second one is, do respondents report often or sometimes being unable to buy necessary food or clothing? Yes or no? The next one is subjective economic difficulty. Do respondents report that family finances are very tight, or depending on how you translate things, that they are struggling? And the fourth one, is do respondents report that they are unable to save at all or that they're spending down their savings on a regular basis. And I sort of asterisk this one because it's a pretty unusual measure, I think, but it's one that we found in previous analyses based on these same data to be a really strong predictor of various measures of well-being, an even stronger measure of that proxy for poverty, the first one. And you can see if you just look at the comparisons here, the weighted comparisons, in every case, the single mothers, or ever divorced mothers to be more precise, report about twice as high a likelihood of each of these measures of economic disadvantage. So clearly there are big differences as we would expect. So results. Question 1. How much of the socioeconomic gradient and mother's economic disadvantage, this is all mothers, not just ever divorced mothers, before we narrow down, is accounted for by differences in divorce and employment trajectories? So first, let's look at the gradient first. These are coefficients from linear probability models. The least educated women, mothers, are high school graduates, or high school or less, I should say. And the other 4 groups are vocational, 2-year vocational school graduates, junior college graduates, and 4-year university graduates. And not surprisingly, we can see that there's a strong negative gradient for each of these measures of disadvantage. In all cases, they're coded so that 1 is the disadvantaged category. And you can see that the disadvantage is particularly strong for low income and inability to save. So for example, university graduate mothers are 18 percentage points less likely to report being in the lowest quartile of household income than their high school counterparts, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So let's look at the covariates of interest. These are educational differences in the experience of divorce. I've already shown you a little bit about that. This is the gradient within sample. You can see that high school graduates or less, about a quarter of them have ever been divorced, compared to 8% of university graduates. So this is about as clear a gradient as you can as you can get. This is a little bit less clear of a gradient, but we're going to be working with 3 measures of employment status, employment at the time of pregnancy, time of realizing pregnancy. So before first birth, 1 year after first birth, and at the time of the survey, which obviously the duration between the second and third measure will depend on when the first birth took place vis-a-vis the survey. But at any rate, there are 4 categories: working regular full-time work, non-standard or part-time work, not working, and then other or missing. And I'm just showing you the employed categories: working in regular full-time work or in non-standard part-time work. And you can see the gradients in the overall proportion or percent here, employed, is not really that great. Maybe a little bit of a gradient prior to first birth, a little bit of a gradient after first birth, but not really all that much difference. But we do see employment in full-time, regular full-time employment being much more common at all 3 points for women with a university education rather than relative to those with a high school degree. And this will turn out to be important. I don't have time to go into details, but for those of you who are interested in non-standard employment and the rise in bad jobs in the United States and elsewhere, we can talk about this, because this is extremely interesting and important for understanding inequality and economic disadvantage in the Japanese context as well. Another way to think about trajectories is stability. This is hard to incorporate in the models, but this is basically just a tabulation, a cross tabulation of the 2 measures around first birth, the measure prior to first birth and a year after first birth. And the blue bars at the bottom here are the ones that involve not working a year after first birth. So the dark blue is out of the labor force, out of the labor force. The lighter blues are in the labor force, leave the labor force. So leaving the labor force and being out of the labor force a year after the first birth. The 2 orange ones are continuous employment. And you can see here a pretty substantial gradient. So 27% of the most highly educated were in the labor force, relative to 15% of women in the lowest group. And more importantly, a quarter of women in the highest group were full-time, as opposed to only 9% in the lowest group. And this will turn out to be important as well. So these are results from the full model. So we've got the employment measures in there, we have divorce in there, and we're trying to understand the degree to which differences that I've just shown you in those two measures across educational categories accounts for that original gradient that I showed you in the earlier slide. The original gradient is replicated here in blue, and the orange is the gradient that remains after controlling for all of these other characteristics that we're interested in. These two components of this constellation of family behavior central to the Diverging Destinies literature. And you can see that, sure, as we would expect based on what I've just shown you, the gradient is attenuated. It's attenuated by about 1/3 in most cases, but 2/3 of it remains. I should also note that divorce is much more important in accounting for the original gradient, the basic gradient, than our differences in employment status, and we can talk about that a little more later. So let me move along. Question number 2. How large is the educational gradient and economic disadvantage among ever divorced mothers? So here we're going to narrow the focus from all mothers just to those 2,000 some in the data who report ever being divorced. And this is the gradient. Looks an awful lot like the gradient that I showed you for all mothers together. And in fact, we can compare the dark blue here is the gradient for all mothers that I showed you earlier. The light blue is the gradient for ever divorced mothers for each of these 4 measures of economic disadvantage. And you can see they look very similar, although the gradient appears to be a little bit stronger among ever divorced mothers, which is interesting. That's particularly true for low income, which is really quite striking. But at any rate, so that's the first step. Much more interesting. This shouldn't be all that interesting. We know that there's a gradient among ever divorced mothers, and this was the issue here is just really, curiosity and quantifying the magnitude of that gradient and providing a baseline for subsequent analyses. And the subsequent analyses will, again, as in the previous set of analyses for all mothers, try to establish how much of that gradient in economic disadvantage is accounted for by the differences in employment trajectories. And then we want to move beyond that constellation or basket of diverging destinies characteristics to think about these other family characteristics or family behaviors that may be relevant for understanding the degree to which the children or mothers and their children of different educational levels are disadvantaged on these various measures. So let me just show you some slides that look very similar to what I showed you for all mothers. These are educational differences in employment history, the same 3 measures before first birth, the year after first birth, at the time of the survey. And here we can see a very similar pattern, maybe a little bit less strong of a gradient in terms of regular employment, except at the time of the survey. You can see that at the time of the survey, there's a very strong educational gradient in the likelihood of the percent in full-time employment, which turns out to be quite important for understanding differences in economic well-being. And here are these other measures that I wanted to talk about. The one on the left, the dark blue, the navy blue, these are educational differences in the percent who say, yes, I'm receiving some child support from my ex-husband, the father of the children. And you can see that this is low for everybody. The highest is 1/4 who report yes to receiving some child support, and that's among university graduates. So you can see a very clear positive gradient here. You can also see a positive gradient in co-residence with parents, which we're using as a proxy for access to financial support and support with child care that would facilitate work-family balance. Something that, as I mentioned earlier, we focused a lot on in our earlier work on single mothers and well-being. And the far right is remarriage, which we see there isn't really much of a gradient at all in. But at any rate, these are the data. And this is what happens when we account for all of these different measures in the analyses. You can see that, again, there's some attenuation of the gradient, and in some cases, a very large attenuation of the gradient, particularly if we look at the much, much lower likelihood that university-educated women report being in the lowest quartile of household income. There's substantial attenuation there, and in others as well. And I should note that employment here is more important than the other three measures in terms of accounting for the gradient, to the extent that the gradient is accounted for actually by these measures. Again, we see that even when we limit our focus to ever divorced mothers, differences in employment trajectories, and as I mentioned, particularly differences in current employment are really relevant for understanding differences in these various measures of economic disadvantage. So I think I'm going to finish right on time. I have a couple of slides just to wrap things up for you, and then very much look forward to hearing your questions and comments, as I said. But just to very briefly wrap up, I went through things very quickly. I know I looked at the number of slides and realized I better be expedient about things, and I hope I wasn't too quick in going through. But just to summarize briefly, we've shown that both divorce and discontinuous employment contribute to the observed socioeconomic differences or educational differences in mothers' well-being. And as I mentioned, this is particularly true for divorce. That strong educational gradient, the negative educational gradient in divorce, really is critical for accounting for, not surprisingly, accounting for the negative gradient in economic disadvantage. And together, these two parts of that broader constellation of family behaviors account for about 1/3 of observed differences. But a large proportion remains unexplained, and that's something that we want to pursue a little bit further in these extensions that I mentioned at the outset. And among ever divorced women, as I just showed you, educational differences in employment histories account for some of the negative gradient, about 1/4 of the gradient. And those other measures of family support, these measures that we want to try to bring in, fold into the diverging destinies framework, account for a little bit less, maybe about 5% or 10% of the gradient overall. And with respect to that fifth question, we find that the gradient is larger in our objective measures. That is I don't think they're necessarily objective, but the measure of low income and the measure of inability to save, and a little bit less pronounced and a little bit harder to understand for the measures, the subjective measures of need and financial difficulty. I don't really know what to make of that yet. I'd be happy to hear any thoughts you have on that, but this is something that we want to think about going forward. So what does all this mean? Well, it means that the educational gradient in economic disadvantage is pronounced in Japan. We knew that, but I think that it's valuable to quantify this, and particularly to quantify it for a subpopulation, the ever divorced population. But what I think really we haven't done in this particular set of analyses, and won't be able to do, but are doing in another set of analyses, and this again, Hyunjin Park is a co-conspirator in this project, is to think very carefully about how this educational gradient in various measures of economic well-being is relevant for children's outcomes, children's cognitive outcomes, children's non-cognitive outcomes, which is really what Diverging Destinies is all about, right? And it's not something that we can do in this particular study, but something that we are tackling in this other set of projects. And I think one of the things that I take from these preliminary analyses is that there is real value in thinking about diverging destinies as it was theoretically articulated, and that is about a constellation or basket of family behaviors, package of family behaviors, instead of just thinking about one in isolation. So we've only looked at two, and we've looked at them kind of, putting one in, putting the other in, and not really thinking too much about their interactions, although we can talk a little bit about that. But I think there's a lot of room to move the Diverging Destinies literature forward, to incorporate some of the theoretical insights in ways that haven't been done so far. Composition appears to be much more important than returns. I haven't really talked about that in these slides, but we've done a little bit of preliminary work on that. I mentioned that this is a real limitation as I see it in the Diverging Destinies literature, but our initial forays into efforts to answer this suggest that composition is a lot more important than returns. And then finally, this other limitation, the lack of attention to these other characteristics, really hasn't been integrated into the literature yet. We try to do that, and we find relatively little evidence that these are all that important, and they're certainly less important than some of the core family behaviors that are central to the Diverging Destinies literature, in this case, divorce and employment trajectories. So I've got a little bit on limitations and next steps, but I see my clock tells me 45 minutes. So I'm going to stop right here. And again, look very much forward to hearing your questions. And thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thank you, Jim, for a very interesting talk. And now we enter the Q&A portion of the talk. Please post your questions online, or just let me know that you have a question. And we especially encourage questions from graduate students and postdocs. I'm going to start with a question from Jerry Berman. Jerry?
Thank you, Jim. Very interesting. I'm actually not a graduate student or a postdoc.
Yeah, I knew that.
You knew that, but I will go ahead and ask
Please.
a couple of questions.
Please.
One is, I have two questions. One is, in much of your talk, you referred to ever divorced.
Mm-hmm.
My question I put in the Q&A was how many are remarried, which you answered subsequently. But I do wonder whether it might be enlightening to separate out the remarried, even though they're not a huge percentage. They're still about 15%, mm-hmm. from the non-remarried, and see if the patterns are different. Then my second question was, speaking from lack of knowledge on the Diverging Destinies literature, mm-hmm. I wonder how you would have done this study differently if you did not know of that literature. It seemed to me what you did is very sensible, et cetera, but I wasn't sure how it benefited from or was informed by the Diverging Destinies literature. Thanks again.
Okay, thanks, Sherry. Those are great questions. The first one is a pretty easy one. The second one is a real, that's really thought-provoking, and I'm probably not gonna, I'll give an answer that I'm probably gonna not regret, but wish I had articulated differently on the, as I think about it later, but I will keep thinking about it. With respect to the first one, the ever divorced, yes, I think that there is value in this, and I'll just mention a few things that are relevant to why we did things the way we did. The first is curiosity, and the fact that along with several colleagues in Japan, we're working on what I think is probably a first effort at understanding step-family fertility in the Japanese context, and understanding how remarried couples form or don't form families. And you know, it's just something that I was doing coincidentally at the same time, and wanted to try to move things forward a little bit. A much better reason for incorporating them in the way that we have is that I do think, and this is related to your second question, that the tendency to think only about family behaviors that were identified in some of the original articulations of the Diverging Destinies literature, which really comes straight out of the second demographic transition literature, may miss some key aspects of family behavior that as family demographers we care about. And remarriage, of course, is one that we know is relevant for mitigating some of the economic disadvantages associated with divorce for women in particular. So wanted to incorporate it in that way. Why not separate them out? I mean, that's a good idea. A lot of the work that I've done with these data so far eliminates them from the start. We focus only on single mother households. So this is really the first time that I've incorporated these people in any analyses with these data. So I can say a lot about the other group, but not much about this group independently. So yes, value in that. Just for what it's worth, we have done a lot of, we have made a lot of efforts to sort of interact these key variables to see, how much does the, how much the educational differences, uh, not only in the prevalence of remarriage, but in the returns to remarriage, help us understand the gradient in economic well-being. And we don't see an awful lot, but again, that's just the, it's the stereotypical, hey, we did this and looked at it real quickly, but haven't thought about it very hard. So this question prompts me to go back and look at that in more detail. So thanks on that. And then how differently how would I have thought about this differently, or how would we have thought about this differently if Sarah hadn't written this and people hadn't sort of picked up on this and developed this literature? That's a great question. Um, I suspect that what we would have done is to do what I think I'm not criticizing, but questioning the previous studies in this body of research for doing, and that is focusing on one family behavior at a time. So we might have just said, okay, how relevant is our differences in divorce for understanding the economic gradient and well-being among mothers? How relevant are differences in employment trajectories for understanding the differences in economic well-being among single mothers, and not really been prompted to think about the fact that there really is this constellation of behaviors that we know are all part of this broader pattern of family bifurcation that really, was first documented in the US, and, that's where all this literature originally comes from. So I suspect that it would have been a narrower paper, one that I and others have kind of already written in many ways, but wouldn't have had this broader, wouldn't have been inspired to cast a wider net, so to speak. So that's my off the cuff answer. And as I said, I'm sure I'll think of a better one on the way home, but for now, that's what I've got. Thank you.
Always get back to me.
I will. Yeah. I hope there'll be a chance to get back to you in person sooner rather than later. Yeah.
Very good. Thanks again.
Yeah. Thanks, Jared. Yeah.
Thank you, Jim. The next question is from Shi Song.
Oh, okay. She's also not a student or a postdoc.
That's right.
Okay. Hi, Jim.
Hi, Shi.
Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this presentation made me think a lot. I just happened to read a few articles by Bill Parrish written in the 1990s yesterday about single mothers in the United States, in which they show that they receive a lot of support, such as free childcare and financial transfers from their relatives, especially from the grandparents. And then in recent years, you probably know Desmond's work on the disposable ties. So he was arguing that now people form more disposable ties with strangers or new acquaintances during those tough times, including our divorce or our eviction. So I was wondering whether we see similar patterns in Japan, or are single mothers more rely on, say, professional services or nannies to cope with those obligations from work and our childcare.
So thanks, Shi. Great questions. Some of which I've thought about an awful lot, and a couple of points that you made I've never thought about. So thanks. I'll talk about the ones that I have thought about a lot first, and then circle back. So in a lot of the work, so one of the first things to note is, to a large degree, I think we can almost eliminate support from ex-husbands. Eliminate's probably too strong a word, but for most single mothers, there really is no support either in instrumental terms or financial terms from the ex-husband. However, a lot of the work that we've done on single mothers in Japan and various dimensions of well-being, aspects of well-being, whether that's life satisfaction, self-rated health, poverty, children's well-being. It's really clear that the support from parents is important. And particularly, we note that about a third of divorced mothers return to their parental home in order to receive that kind of support. And that's the motivation for including that in this paper as one of those other family characteristics that isn't really central to the Diverging Destinies literature. One thing I should note, having said that it is important as a mitigating factor, it mitigates disadvantage, broadly defined to some degree. One of the things that we've also found is that often, and again, this is relevant for thinking about intergenerational transmission of disadvantage, a lot of divorced women in Japan, which we've seen are concentrated among those with lower levels of education, their parents aren't in very good economic shape either. So
Right.
the degree to which they're able to, capitalize or the degree to which the support received via co-residence or proximate residence or transfers across larger distances isn't necessarily all that helpful. So with respect to the things that I don't, well, one other thing I do know something about is nannies, and that is no nannies, no babysitters. Most divorced women couldn't afford them, as we see by the 50% poverty rate. But B, it's just not really there's not a market for that, or it's a very young market in the Japanese context. But the question that you raised about sort of disposable ties or non-familial connections, that's fascinating. And I've never thought about that in the context of this particular project. And I will. I don't think that there's a lot that we can do with this given the data that we have access to, primarily because the people who designed the survey never thought about this either. So I don't think that there's really much there. But to the degree that single motherhood is associated with such high levels of disadvantage, to the degree that there are a lot more single mothers in Japan sharing this economic disadvantage, to the degree that there are online, for example, platforms that would allow for people to connect with others in similar circumstances or in different circumstances to get some kind of support, that's tremendously interesting. And I have to say, I really don't know the answer, but I'd like to think about this more.
Okay, thanks,
Thank you.
Jim.
Yeah, thanks. Great question.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, we are out of time. We continue our tradition of ending promptly at 1 p.m. But we have a few more questions from Pilar, Michelle, Francesco, Villery. Hi, Francesco and HP.
Hi, Francesco.
You will get the questions. I encourage everybody to continue this conversation with Jim. Okay, thanks a lot, Jim. It's always a pleasure to see you, and we will get together hopefully soon.
Okay, thank you so much again, everybody. And please do send emails if you have questions or comments. I'd love to hear them. Thank you, everybody. Yeah.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Jim.